I think the fact that we're here is patently not an exercise in democratic scrutiny by this House. It's nothing more than a manoeuvre to precisely avoid effective scrutiny of this measure, not just in this House but amongst the broader public. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's happening because the political establishment has learned the lessons of the last time people got information, Lisbon and so on. So it's better that we keep them in the dark. Now, I'm so shocked about some of the stuff that's happened this week that I still can't get my head around it. I mean, the government has been valiantly trying to pitch PESCO as really nothing for us to worry about, something Ireland can sign up to without any impact on our policy of neutrality at all. And that is a comforting position, not coming from people who have so much undermined our neutrality as it is. But as Deputy Ryan said earlier, there's absolutely no reason why this decision couldn't be delayed. So if you're so confident that you can stand over the arguments and answer the questions on this issue, then why are we ramming it through today? It hasn't been answered, and I think the silence itself is the answer. PESCO doesn't mean us joining a European army, the government tells us, specifically despite the fact that Macron in September specifically called for the establishment of an EU intervention force that would give Europe autonomous capacity for action by 2020. He said that to achieve this, a good place to start would be what the EU has already approved, a common defence fund and PESCO. And while the government sneers at the fears of some people in this House and indeed the broader public if they got to hear about it in relation to whether this involves Ireland in a potential European army, let's not forget that when the Taoiseach met Macron a few weeks after his bold statements about the creation of a European army, the Taoiseach gave him full support, with defence being specifically mentioned. And I agree. I was a bit surprised yesterday when the Taoiseach answered Deputy Wallace that he didn't do that sort of fudge. There's nothing to see, don't be worrying about it really. He actually came out and argued for an EU army in preference to a US army. Well, I don't want an EU army. I certainly don't, and I don't want Irish forces involved in that, and I don't think most Irish people do either. I think there's no doubt about it, and deputies have made this point already. EU countries will commit to increase military spending. PESCO has been absolutely driven by the arms industry. That shouldn't surprise us, but the official line that this doesn't specifically commit us to NATO's bottom line of moving towards 2% of GDP for defence budgets by 2020. However, by committing ourselves to closer cooperation, a commitment that will be monitored, we are in fact committing ourselves to increased defence spending. Some have estimated that Ireland is likely to be handing over more than €1.3 billion by 2021, and that's a conservative estimate, and it's galling to our Defence Forces personnel who are living on a shoestring that we would be able to put our hands on that type of money when we can't even pay them decent pay and conditions. It's an absolute outrage as far as I'm concerned, and it is the case that the government is bouncing us into this, doing it so quickly without any level of proper public debate. And I think Conor Brady in the Sunday Times in 2016 actually sketched it out rather well when he said, talking about closer EU defence cooperation, and he wrote, "Our politicians, as our military top brass, senior civil servants and diplomats, agree with it, but it would be political suicide for any of them to assault Irish neutrality full on." So he concludes, a policy of low-level, pragmatic collaboration with our EU partners in the building of defence capability is probably the best option. We could still argue then that we're not, strictly speaking, part of EU defence arrangements. It would be hypocritical, of course, but we've no great reputation for straight talking anyway. And that, to me, was very prophetic. It sums up exactly the approach being taken by the government of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, ably backed up by their independent alliance colleagues approaching this issue. I have to say, for the government to perform an end run around not just the national parliament here, but the public, whose money is going to be shovelled into this abomination, the public whose bodies will be the fodder in the cannons of an EU army, the public who are the ultimate bosses of us in here. It's absolutely unprecedented that something like this is happening. And when I first raised it on the Business Committee in November, when this was mentioned in the European Council, we were assured that there would be full democratic procedures in relation to this matter. But that's not what happened, despite the fact that other deputies tabled topical issues and so on and tried to raise the issues. When we went to the Business Committee last week, there was no mention of it. There was no mention of it for this week, and there was no mention of it for next week, until it was shoehorned into the agenda earlier this week. And that is something that's unprecedented, and I think there's no doubt about it that it is going to be looked back in time as one of the most treacherous decisions that this House has ever taken. And why are we doing it? A scene has been created where saving and protecting ourselves from these marauding herds that are suddenly on our borders that we need to defend ourselves, these terrorists, we need to engage in surveillance, Deputy Chambers tells us. Well, who's the surveillance against? Whose world are you making safer? The past decade has been the most militarised in the world's history, and yet there are more wars in more places now than ever before. If you want to make the world safe against terrorism, well then you stop interfering in countries and destroying the lives of people who are then driven into terrorism as a so-called solution. And to have our borders militarised in the way in which they are, to keep out the victims of those crises, to have surveillance on them, to make sure that they don't come here, it's an absolute disgrace. If you were really serious about combating terrorism and protecting the citizens of this state, you would immediately end the use of Shannon Airport by the US military, end the hypocrisy of where we say we're military neutral, but bend the knee to the US establishment, to the EU, who are our friends now in terms of Brexit, and ultimately to their bosses, the arms industry, who are driving this to their own profit and the detriment of humanity.
Thank you very much, Deputy.